So hello, everyone. This is Mike Dilworth with Executive Networks. We're really to have you all here on the webinar today. We're here on this call and this webinar with Professor Rob Cross from Babson. As some of you know who have been on the webinar series, this is our third one and actually last one in this series. And we've been focusing on Rob's recent work around networks and network analysis and the impact of his work on organizational effectiveness and agile organizations. We're going to be digging in, as you see in the title today, on agile teams and agile organizations. This webinar series and this whole research initiative has been in collaboration with IRC for HR, and if you want to check them out, I think it's ircforhr.org. And then Rob, of course, is just robcross.org, and lots of materials. There's also a website for the Connected Commons that you can access. I'm actually at a conference in New York City today, and it's with a group of CEOs that are, hearing about changing nature of organizations and some implications for the economy. And one of the things that is certainly a theme here is the need for organizations to be more agile, to be more flexible and adaptive, to the changing nature of the economy and the events that take place. I just saw that the executive CFO of Huawei was arrested in Canada today, as we all have seen, and the Dow dropped 450 points. So I think that's one of these indications of external factors that organizations and the people that work within them have to deal with every day. So as always, I'm really happy to have Rob here with us today, and I'm going to turn it over to you. Thank you for being here, Rob.
Great, thank you, Mike. So let me thank everybody for the time to be here, and thank Executive Networks for sponsoring this series, and obviously Innovation Resource Center for Human Resources for sponsoring the work and helping us to bring some of these ideas out there. As Mike said, this is the end of a three-part series, and to bring people up to speed that may not have participated in the prior series, this work is very much focused on a broad study of research we did in the Connected Commons on how people distinguish themselves through networks from a performance standpoint. And so what we're walking through can also be found in this white paper that we wrote for the Commons. It's publicly available, and you can go out to the Connected Commons website and pull down the white paper on the invisible network strategies of successful people. And the core notion is what we did through this work is see how do people innovate, execute, and thrive as a product of being able to manage connectivity differently today, and then built that into a whole suite of lessons and practices to make it as pragmatic as possible for people and not just leave things in the traditional kind of, principle idea that you see with traditional business school writing. And so the real strength of what the Innovation Resource Center for Human Resources has brought to bear is just this ability to drive a whole series of these ideas into very specific pragmatics. And you'll see on the invitation that we have 4 of the lessons. There's 4 kind of content-oriented lessons in each of these domains, and these are 3 to 5 page write-ups of what people are doing differently. Now today, what I want to focus heavily on and tie to this really crazy trend towards agile, not that it's a bad thing, but that it's often done in isolation of understanding the networks that people are pulling people from or that need to integrate back into an organization to be successful. And I want to think a little bit about 2 ideas from the execute framework. One is when we look at agility, specifically at the point of execution of where leaders need to drive results, what do we see that's unique in terms of how they're managing networks and not just teams today? Because the problem for most of us is that work is, we throw the concept of teams at problems, yet people aren't really in teams in the way we've thought about them or designed them in the past. People are on 4 to 5 of these efforts. There's not enough time to build mission, vision, purpose, or these entities grow to extremely large things, and we still call them teams when they're in the 30s, 50s, and 100s. Really what we're seeing is it's networks more and more that people are managing. And even when we look at the teams and see what the high performers are doing. It's a pattern of collaboration inside and outside of that group that promotes success. That's point number one. Point number two is I want to focus on this idea of transitions as well. So when people either come into the organization, they're promoted up, they do a lateral transfer, the role changes around them dramatically. What are the network correlates of success? What do we see about more successful people and how they're managing entry into that role, engagement of influencers, other things that promote the odds of success? And the key point for me there is way too often we take a solely a human capital lens to that, and we see people transition and fail. And rather than think about could it be an invisible network strategy behind them that's causing problems, we blame the individual. We say, gosh, they weren't ready for it, and they get typically stigmatized, and all sorts of negative things happen there. And so I want to look at that a little bit differently with this lens. So if we take Agile, and it's again a great methodology built out from the software world that companies are deploying like crazy in different places, and it's as you shift the deployments from building code for software to broadly doing things, and I constantly hear this term that we need SEAL teams, or we need scrums, or we need speedboats, or other analogies to form these kind of smaller units. A lot of times what companies are missing is that you're not just in many of these newer instances embedding code back into software, right? Actually, what they're starting to try and tackle with this methodology are broad organizational changes where you need to implement those changes and get adoption from a much broader uptake of individuals out there. And so what we're finding is the more that you can be thinking about not just staffing these teams in an agile methodology and picking off the top of your head around who are the best people to put into that room, because the problem with that approach is universally we end up picking the already busy people. And you put them into these teams and say, gosh, they're going to be isolated. But the reality is every single consulting firm out there has told me, these teams are isolated, they don't have other assignments. But without a doubt that doesn't stop the network of people coming to them, particularly in strong culture companies. And if they have to go back into that context, they've got to be responsive. And it tends to further propagate overload in ways that are really hurting some of the transitions to Agile that I see right now. What we've seen be more successful is several of the companies in the consortium I run, the Connected Commons, have actually gone out and done full company network analyses. And so they have, massive network assessments done as a product of tying it to a culture survey or an engagement survey or things like that. And that enables them to think a little bit differently about who do we put on these teams. And so, if you're starting 20 initiatives, what you want to be thinking about is not just who are the best experts there, but who are the influencers that we want to grab in terms of where this is going to need to be implemented. Where are the groups that we need to get engaged early so that we can increase the odds that we're more successful in the implementation. It sounds small, but it's a really big deal that we've seen with our more successful leaders. Every single time we focused in on where leaders outperformed as a product of making something significant happen, they were always simultaneously adapting the innovation, whether it be a new product, a new service, a new client, a new organizational implementation, whatever it may be, simultaneously innovating on the outcome and the network at the same time. So they were much more likely to be thinking about who are the key players within these nodes. And I'll call some of these players central connectors. They tend to have a lot of connections within a given geography function unit and getting them engaged early. They would also focus on what I'll call boundary spanners, the people that integrate subgroups in the network and knit people together. They're Malcolm Gladwell's tipping point people, if you will, and the people that are energizers, the people that just create enthusiasm and get momentum behind an initiative. The more that you can think about your agile transitions with this network lens in mind and pick people a little bit differently. Certainly get your experts in the room, but if you're also including either on that team or through the process, bringing those perspectives into the team of the people that need to adopt the implementation, you do much better. Over and over and over again, we see the odds of uptake and success are much more effective there. Second thing we see people doing a lot more effectively through transitions to Agile is also picking people to go onto these initiatives that also create strategic connections within the organization. So it may be where you're trying to cross-sell differently, where you're trying to get geographic dispersion to be less of an impediment. But the more that you can go in and say, these are the teams that we want engaged as part of an initiative, and I'm just going to grab some standalone brokers here, you can isolate out the right set of people, get them connected into the Agile initiative, very simple thing, and then get them reaching out in the network in a very targeted way. And we always find that this has a really significant impact on the uptake and the effectiveness of an implementation, but also secondarily, it can integrate a lateral network where you need it to be more effective, right? And so typically what we're seeing with organizations is that this is happening across core processes. It's happening where you are not getting scale efficiencies, and you need people that are doing similar kinds of work connected, across geography, function, unit, or where you have innovation potential. Third, if you have the network lens at hand, then what you also really want to be thinking carefully about is not how do we just grab these the high reputation people, again, because they're always going to be the people that come top of mind, and they're always going to be typically the most busy. But use what I'll call the second tier connectors, right? Start to identify who are the next layer down in the networks, that if you get them involved in the Agile initiatives, you can do much better, much more effectively in terms of not propagating overload. You have an effect of actually bringing newcomers into the fray a little bit more specifically. Now, obviously, the analytics behind this are much more robust. I'm just trying to, this is the end of a 3-part series, and you all have seen me, show different kinds of analytics, and I'm just trying to give you a sense of the degree to which very simple inclusion of a network question, an engagement survey, culture survey, whatever it may be, can give some pretty dramatic insights in making these transitions to Agile, more effective at a team level. And so I want to put this back to you, and I'm not going to do a poll on this, but I want to make this a little bit real for a second. And people on the phone, just reflect for me for a moment on the percent of time the average employee in your organization spends in a given week on these 3 activities cumulatively. So time on the phone, time on email, and time in meetings, and just ballpark it, right? Use yourself as a proxy, other leaders you care about, but just kind of get that number in your head. And usually what we'll see if we're live with a poll is that number comes somewhere between 80% is typically the lower side of the spectrum, up to 110% for somebody that's really, drowning in different aspects of collaborative work. And then I want to ask you the second question is, how, on a scale of 1 to 10, how effectively is this resource managed? If you think about the way in which we've seen the collaborative intensity of work explode, how are we doing managing the amount of time that's going into this collaborative work? And how can we get better, right, at it? And put it in the context, scale of 1 to 10, just get a number in your head. Put this question in the context of the idea that we can track expenses to 2 decimal places, right? We know how to get airline receipts down to 2 decimal places. Cost allocations are tremendously detailed, et cetera. But for some reason, when it comes to the collaborative aspects of work, and as we're transitioning more to these network-based designs, we have very little insight into the effect that we're having with the changes that we're making. And it's causing a tremendous number of headaches inside organizations. This transition to Agile is one notion where you have the absolutely fantastic consulting methodologies coming into play, but they're not thinking about who is going into these teams in ways that makes, it is a product of pulling people out of networks and embedding them in. We look at other things. This is one of the major consulting firms delivered a piece around the 5 trademarks of Agile organizations. And, this is more broadly thinking about the notion of agility, not just in terms of Agile teams and methodologies and the specifics of that, but more broadly looking at this idea of agility and how it's occurring. And so I pulled this out and started to look down this, because the Agile idea is a really core one for me and work that I'm doing going forward too, and thinking about how organizations become more successful. And I get that this list is aspirational. You see things like this, and it's never going to be the case that everybody does every one of these things. These are just practices or processes that are put out there. But I looked at this list, and then I started thinking about the question I just asked you about what percentage of time do employees in our organization spend on phone, on email, and meetings. And then I went back to this list, assuming we're somewhere around 80%, let's say. And I said, which of these practices is going to have the effect of increasing the collaborative intensity of work? right? Which one can I look down here and I can just see no way possible that this thing is going to get done without increasing the collaborative intensity of the work? And when I did that, I colored everything red, and it came out this way. And I probably was being conservative. There's probably a couple other points in here that I could have gone into and said, this is going to drive a greater collaborative demands without a concurrent reduction of some other collaborative demand to make space for it. And it hit me, like a ton of bricks, that this is one of the things that's killing us, right? We're going for these new ways of working, and we've painted the enemy as slowness in decision making or silos, and yet we're building another enemy ultimately with so many of the things that we're implementing, because it's going to create all sorts of invisible demands and overload points on people. So in a prior webinar for executive networks, we covered some of the collaborative overload work 18 months ago, but I just would bring that back for a second and think about where we've seen contexts where people have come into an organization and been very successful and promoted up the hierarchy over and over and over again. I hear these stories as I engage in this work, and oftentimes they get to points where they start to falter in different ways. So this live example was not this individual. It's a disguised photo, obviously disguised initial, disguised name, but it was somebody in the life sciences company that had come in, done great work for 4 or 5 years, and then as a product of wins was promoted very rapidly for about a 20-year period up the organization until he was put into a very senior leadership spot and considered to be the next CEO, and yet was faltering, very, very significantly. The engagement scores in his groups were going down. He wasn't hitting innovation trajectories, et cetera. And it was a mystery to this organization. The CEO would even talk to me and say, here's somebody that had done wonderfully throughout. From what I can see, he's doing everything he should. He's practicing servant-based mindset to leadership. He's taken layers out of the hierarchy, spans and layers, whatever it may be. And yet, he's still, struggling. His peers are grumbling, engagement scores faltering, et cetera. So when in this case, we put the network lens on, and you start to see that here was somebody that had, in this group alone, 118 people coming to him frequently, another 78 that said they needed more of his time. And yet, the company, and this is my big point in this, the company wasn't seeing this, right? And the people that were wondering why this person was failing wasn't reflecting on the degree to which the way he came in had created an implosion on them and was faltering and causing him problems. Now, we've written in different ways, very targeted things you can do, and you can pull this off my website, the Connected Commons website. There's a ton of resources out there about very tactical ways you can manage collaborative overload and collaborative demands to this. So my point in bringing this up here was not to redo what we covered about 18 months ago, but rather to make the point that Scott didn't do all these things, right? He came into that new role and he didn't go adapt the agile organization and all these practices that we presumably need to have to be agile in the coming context. Really what he did was just 3 things. He came in and he focused on shared purpose and vision activities, taking layers out of the hierarchy, and then a shared and servant-based mindset of leadership. And it brought him to his knees. And was literally, from a health standpoint, he wasn't doing well. His marriage was suffering. And performance-wise, obviously, he was kind of working his way out of what had been a traditionally very successful career. And it wasn't hoarding information. And so what I'd ask you to think a little bit about, and again, kind of keep this idea in mind, is how are you managing this? How are you managing the collaborative intensity of the work? And this comes from somebody that follows all the consulting firms constantly today in terms of the different formal methodologies they have, the talent-based strategies they have. They're all saying that they're focused on network-based designs and greater collaboration, yet they're very rarely actually assessing the collaborative intensity of the work and making the changes with an eye to the effect they're going to have on either organizations or people out there. So, Mike, I said we were going to pause here for a second to see if you have picked up any hits on the site or any kind of thoughts or questions or things like that from you. So let me see if I can turn it back to you for a moment here.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Rob. So I sent out a chat. Anybody that has a question for Rob, please submit it using the question feature of GoToMeeting, and we'll answer. I'll read those questions to Rob. But I do have a question, Rob, because in our networks, there's a lot of talk about, agile. And I think there's a lot of misunderstanding of what agile actually is. And there's, simply, people are using the term very, very broadly, and really more about the word agility versus agile as a way of working, a process, framework for working that, as you've mentioned, comes out of software development. So I'm wondering, just in the context of the organizations that you work with and through your research, definitionally, what do these words mean to you? And are you seeing that people are sort of misusing them?
Yeah, I think I hear the same thing, in all the companies that we're engaging with around the commons. And that's why this has become one of our real hallmark activities over the next 2 or so years. One is you hear initiatives over and over again that are true kind of agile implementations. And I say true in the sense that, borrowing from what we know about Scrum teams and sprints and all that. The problem with that for me, though, and I was with the CEO of a major financial services organization just last week, and, you heard this person talking about, we're going to move this whole organization to SEAL teams. Right. And they have this mindset of, if we just get these rapid, small teams out there, that we're going to be just fine. And for some places that works. Amazon and the 2 pizza team, idea. It's amazing what they or Gore or some other places do by sacrificing notions of control and scale for innovation and agility. But in other contexts, what the CEOs are doing is they have this metaphor that's not accurate. They just don't have this metaphor of also thinking about the degree to which, when they form these teams, they have to get the ideas back into the mothership. And that's been a huge strength of what my friend Michael Arena did with General Motors, was thinking about not just how do you form these more agile efforts, but then how do you create this adaptive space that helps to bring these efforts back into the enterprise and have impact. And if you haven't seen or read that book, I would strongly recommend it, based on the really neat successes that they were able to accomplish in a very kind of staid and static culture. So I see that for sure out there, and then I see a whole swath of these other initiatives, ranging from the agile organization idea here to spans and layers to talent-based strategies on the liquid workforce, where people are engaging in efforts and they're targeting one thing. So the spans and layers work is always saying, gosh, if we can just speed decision making in essence and reduce bureaucracy, we're going to be fine. The mistake they make is that they don't then think about what is the overload that's created, particularly around the manager layer, and how does that negatively affect speed, right? And so you may get potentially a clearer org chart, clearer line of sight to decision making, but you end up with overloaded people that can't respond to their colleagues, can't respond to their peers. They have higher attrition rates around them. And there are very significant negative consequences that actually make the place less agile in several contexts that I've been a part of. So I think it's an interesting thing definitionally, but it's also an interesting thing around what are we trying to solve for, and how do we really think about this?
Yeah, great. Thank you. And one of the questions from our audience, I think, is in line with this. Our group recently undertook a wholesale review of current practice as part of a set of goals intended to reset our charter and project a new way forward. One key agreement currently being implemented is a full-blown adoption of Agile. This is the good part, getting all on the same page, so to speak. The challenge is to leverage tools like Jira to apply Agile approaches efficiently. Any ideas on approaches to consider? For instance, managers are treating sprints as, at-large task lists, in the name. So anyway, Robbie, I think you get the idea behind the question.
Yeah, and so this is, of course, where I'm the boy with the hammer. Because I do think, and I really want to emphasize this, it's not it's not agile that I think is the problem. It's going through these implementations without truly understanding the way work is happening today in the networks. So again, when I this one organization, we had a major, we had a full organization O&A. They were just about to move to 40 very significant agile implementations. I think the person in charge of this had a $45 million budget, and these were very significant initiatives they were trying to accomplish. And he, in this case, had already formed the teams that they were going to use right as the network information came in from their full company O&A. And we were able to look down and say, if you go with your list, you're going to kill this place. You know what I mean? You're not aware of the way you're pulling people out of workflows and the disruption that's going to have in terms of, how work is actually going on. So the people you're taking and the gaps that get created, but you're also not really going to get agile from those initiatives too, because the culture of this place is not going to just let everybody stop going to that individual, right? Very relationally, highly, intensive culture in the organization. So my point in this, it was not to say don't do it, but it was to say use the network analytics to define who you bring into the team. Bring your second tier connectors in, bring your brokers in, do different things that engage the network in a different way, and you'll get really good success. And it was funny, like I actually positioned it back to him. This is where I, as an academic, I roll my eyes sometimes at things I say. I said, let's set it up as an experiment. You pick 20 off this list of 40, 5, I think it was, and staff it your way, and then take 25 and staff it my way, and let's see who wins. and of course, he rolled his eyes at me because it was a $45 million budget in his career, and he definitely didn't want to do that. But you get the idea, is that from my standpoint, the lens that I'm taking into this, it's more focused on how do we make sure that we're recognizing the demands on the system, and we're not shooting for rapid decision making and then missing the unintended consequences of what we're creating out there. And again, I put this back to people to remember what I asked you earlier. I said, what percent of your time is spent on the phone, on email, and in meetings? And how are you managing it? Right? How are you as an enterprise actually managing it? Because it's not a trivial thing these days. We've seen the collaborative demands just, explode in different ways. So I'm going to keep us moving.
Yeah, just let me say one thing from a question. We will be sharing these slides or making them available to you, so you don't have to, take pictures of your screens as we roll through it. But Rob, back over to you.
Okay, great, thank you. And I intentionally put this up there to let people have a bit of soak time with it, because it's a framework that's guiding one of our core research agendas in the Commons in the coming, probably 2 to 3 years ultimately. But the notion for me is most of our major efforts to make improvements in either efficiencies or time to market or other things can boil down to something in one of these 4 categories. It's either formal restructurings we're engaging in, revised ways of looking at the future of work and talent, culture intervention efforts, or technology deployments. And many of these efforts, oftentimes they'll say that they're trying to, manage network-based enterprises or get greater collaboration, but they're not doing it with the analytics in place, right? Or actually thinking about the collaborative intensity of the work and the impact that it has. So I just want to take you all down with the time that we have here, two paths in this. I'm not going to go into culture or technology for purposes of today, but if we just look at formal structure, everybody and their cousin has, moved into matrix-based designs already. Most people now are going through some very significant spans and layers work, as well as some very significant, moves towards agile. Again, all this stuff makes sense. I'm not critiquing the notion behind it. What I am critiquing is doing it blindly without understanding how the collaborative aspects of the work will cause you problems. So this major life sciences organization, CEO on down, was convinced by one of the major consulting firms that we have to go to spans and layers, right? And the funny thing for me is, especially one of the firms, I'm not going to mention who it is, but it always seems to be a span of control of 8. That's the optimal, right? It doesn't matter whether I'm in financial services, pharmaceuticals, software, it's always 8 somehow out there. And so in this organization, we actually had the network information in place. And so we backed away and said, okay, let's look at what you're doing from a formal structure standpoint, but then let's bring in the network information. So we first took the formal structure, and then we said, okay, how many direct reports do each of these people have? If we're universally moving to a span of control of 8, and this is going to be forced down almost dogmatically, from top to bottom. And we looked and saw, okay, these are the directors. Obviously, this is, I'm not going to mention the name or anything about this organization. This is just one unit of one of the major life sciences companies. And then we overlaid, first three people got out of there. They said, we don't like what's coming, so they left. So you think about the impact of that too. But then we overlaid the network information. So I just said, how many times our people sought out for information in the network that we have. And you can see the scores in here. Director 1, 75 incoming ties. Director 2, 105 incoming ties. Then on top of that, we threw in a second network question that I always ask around who do you need greater contact with to be successful in your work. And what we see in this is when we see the proportion of people that need greater access to an individual rise, to beyond about 25 to 30% of their network, then they start to become significant impediments to agility. Right? They start to be burning out. A lot of times they don't realize what they're slowing down in different ways in the network. You don't have analytics a lot of times to pick it up. And worse yet, it starts to drive a lot of attrition around there. In fact, one of the studies we finished recently showed that the leaders that were overloaded in this lens, a lot of people coming to your information and more than 25% of those people saying, I have to get more of their time to hit my business goals. The attrition rates were about 260% higher around those leaders than others. Right? And so what we're looking for is, where do you have leaders here that are at that threshold of overload, and then what is this change going to do, right, to them? And so, you could very quickly then pivot and say, we already have 4 people just in this small group that are already at the threshold of what they can absorb. And some of this may be streamlining their work, but some of it is also just the nature of the transactions. And yet we're about to increase their span of control. We're about to factor on anywhere from 50 to 25% more work. And what's the impact of that? And then we had others that were doing well, more transactional related work, and maybe could handle greater responsibilities in terms of the collaborative nature of the work. Was more transactional, less complex in different ways. And then others that were subject matter experts. And you start focusing on the degree to which, putting more responsibilities on them is going to affect the impact that they can have in the system. So you get the idea. It's not that you don't do it, but that the more that you're bringing in the analytics, it starts to give you a really different insight on, is our pursuit of speed to decision making obscuring other things that are going to slow us down and other problems that are going to materialize. And all I'm doing here is showing the overload idea. When we map goal alignments and other things like that, you see other fairly significant impediments to agility. Now, the work we did with IRC for HR was very geared towards not so much the massive organizational changes, but just saying for teams that need to execute, and these teams can be groups of 8 or 10, and traditional teams up to groups of 200, 250, looking at the networks within those teams and seeing what are the collaborative patterns that drive success. Right. And what we've seen in this work, when we go out and do massive network analyses, and then we get any place we can get that has team level performance data, we can pull those networks out and start to see that what are the network drivers of success in those efforts. And over and over again, what we're seeing more and more is you can have any number of different combinations of human capital in a group, yet if the collaborative pattern isn't reflective of what needs to occur both within and outside of that team, then you get lower performance. And so the strength of this work, and one of the tool sets that's posted on the invite here from IRC for HR, is we're able to isolate in and say these entities, whether they're teams of 10 or initiatives to 120 that we're calling a team, maybe a product platform or other things like that, when they're doing well, you have a tendency to see 4 points in the networks managed better. They in the center, they're avoiding overload around key players and key roles, and they're recognizing the people that are having a big collaborative impact. On the fringe, they're getting newcomers engaged more rapidly, and they're not letting either certain kinds of expertise or certain geographies suffer, too great a dispersion. In terms of silos, the leaders are ensuring that they're getting connections, not every silo, right, and not everybody in the networks are already overloaded, but they're more aware of getting the right subsets of interdependencies together that give either the innovation or allow that team to go to market more holistically the way it should, or that give them scale. So you get the idea. There's 4 dimensions in the networks that boils down into 8 practices that we wrote about in the case that they're the lesson plan that again, IRC4HR enabled us to kind of put this content out there. And this can be an easy tool, right, to grab. You don't have to do a network analysis to make these ideas actionable. You can take that idea and look at the specific practices and go back to the team leaders, have them self-rate on how they're doing on these things, not with the idea that they're going to go do all 8 of them, but with the idea that usually 2 or so things pop out as we need to do better at this. And they can, go back and focus on their teams in that way. So first point for me is that when you take this lens, and you either do it through the analytics, as I was showing you with the formal restructurings, and make sure that you're not having unintended consequences, or you just intuitively look and say, and everybody gets this, right, immediately. And it's not actually teams that are delivering the results these days. It's definitely the network inside and outside of the teams. Even if you look at some of the things like Google's work or others, implicitly that's what they were showing in the result that focused around the team level effectiveness. And the more that you can either take toolkits like we have here that just give people prompts to think about these 4 points in the network, 8 practices, or the thing I'm most excited within the Connected Commons is we're just wrapping up a very rapid network diagnostic that's geared towards applying these ideas to these kind of team level outcomes. And I keep saying kind of team level outcomes because, again, I think too often our notions of what these people are doing, what the teams are doing, is misplaced. The leaders are throwing the concept of teams at something because it gets it off their plate. But it's really the networks that need to form inside and outside of these groups. The more you can see that and you can put dimensions on it, the better. So first piece in this, as I mentioned to everybody in the beginning, was to say, let's look at agility in terms of where work is happening. And if we can put this network lens on it, we can see different levers, right, of performance. When I take the same idea, and then I'm gonna bring Mike back in a minute here, same idea, and think about, well, not in addition to kind of structural changes that everybody in HR is always involved in at some level, what about talent-based decisions and ways that we're approaching kind of different, the future of work efforts, or the Great Place to Work scores, and how do we get those up, or recruiting processes, other things like that. They all, in my mind, at least in what I'm seeing, and again, I recognize completely I'm the boy with a hammer. I'm interested in why are we missing the collaborative intensity of the work, but way too often there is solely a human capital lens placed on people's success. And so if we just look at this idea of transitions as the second, key lesson that I wanted to focus on in terms of the work we did, with executive networks and IRC4HR, what is amazing to me is the degree to which companies invest in the recruiting process and actually are sometimes thinking about networks in the recruiting process in different ways, either how to get to people where they may have fit. It's stunning, right? The degree to which we put effort into trying to get the right person in the organization compared to what we do to try to make sure they fit when they get in there, right? And we have this idea that the human that we're trying to get is a bundle of skills and capabilities, and if we can just nail that right, then we're going to get them in, and they're going to stay. And there's definitely success stories, and I'm obviously, overstating the issue given who I am and what I'm interested in. But in contrast, there's incredibly little effort focused around what do the networks of people look like when they actually come into an organization and are successful, and how do we adapt that and ensure that that piece of the equation is working well. So most often I hear people come into new organizations. If we think about a transition here as just entry into the organization, people come in and they're told, I hear this all the time, every company I'm in, they say, well, networks matter here more than anywhere else, right? And if I hear this once, I hear it 80 times through the year. And I'll say, great, what do you do to help people build it? And, oh, we have our leaders come in and they tell them networks matter here more than anywhere else, and go build a big one. And then we have a cocktail hour. And the number again of times that I hear people tell me in our onboarding process, oh, we do networking. And that's really what they mean, right? The leaders come in and give them that stunning advice, and then they go have a cocktail hour. In contrast, think about if you put the analytics against it, what you could start to do differently. And some of the members of the consortium I run have done a fantastic job at this. We'll go out and map 40, 50,000 person organizations and collect attrition data from a monthly standpoint and start to see that, yeah, on entry you need a decent network, but it's actually not a tie to the boss that matters. It's a tie to network influencers, so the central connectors and brokers that I mentioned early. And it's actually not reaching that matters. It's actually being sought. That's a real predictor of people that slingshot in. You say, well, why does that matter? Well, typically you're told in these entry programs, go build your brand, right? Go tell people what you do, make yourself useful. And people go out and say, here's what I've done before. And 9 times out of 10 strong culture companies, they're rejected for that, right? Nobody wants to hear it. They don't want to, hear what this person did elsewhere outside of the context of their needs. And so what we were seeing in this work is that the people that are successful, they come in, they set up a lot of meetings early with these network influencers, not just the first 90 days stuff from the formal leaders, but the informal opinion leaders that they get to through their leader, through other mechanisms. And then most importantly, they're asking a ton of questions early in the discussions. They're slowly morphing their expertise to the incumbent's needs that give status, create energy, and create a mutual win. Right? They do those things. The first 3 conversations may not work out, but number 5, 8, and 12 are the ones that pull them in because they've created pull for themselves. And so that's one idea of if you have the analytics and you see that it's actually pull that you need to create, not push, in terms of your brand, and that there are very specific behaviors that matter in the first 9 months, you can teach that. Right? We have some companies in the consortium that redesign their entry processes and also, these virtual programs that over the course of the first 18 months really help target specific kinds of network connectivity at certain points. So, for example, on entry, we know that if you want to reduce the 3 to 5 years it takes people to get the connectivity to the high performer, you create pull, you get them to the influencers. Lateral transfers, the really critical thing you need to do is help people cover skill gaps that are created by that transition, whether it's markets, technical, political, and help them get to opinion leaders early. Promotions, especially manager, first level leader to manager, it's really critical that you help them manage overload and work through the collaborative intensity of the transition, and also to build an enterprise network. And it's not connections within their group that matter as so much as the more lateral ones. And then the ones that I'm most interested in, particularly with this massive, concern people have with AI and technology taking over, is how do we create contexts where people are able to reinvent themselves, right? So AI shouldn't terrify people per se. We have other technical innovations that have evolved, over the past 100 years. The interesting thing to me is some people adapt to that much better than others. And what we see is that is very much a network play as well. We find the people that have broad networks, early stage problem solvings, they do much better in these kind of transitions and acknowledge when roles are shifting around them. And so this I'll put back, Mike, this is, I encourage you to kind of jump in, but I'd put it back to people on the call here is how often in your organization have you seen some kind of transition failure? Either people come in and get rejected out and people say, oh, that person doesn't get it, versus how are we as a system pulling them in? Or some kind of promotion that doesn't work, like I was describing with Scott earlier, and we say, oh, that person couldn't handle it, right? They weren't ready, versus seeing that it was a network failure. And what's the effect of that, right? Of not being kind of transparent in terms of the network dimensions that matter. So, Mike, let me bring you in one more time here.
Yeah.
We'll get us home.
Okay, great. Well, I think some people had some questions about some earlier slides or statements. One was around Michael Arena's book, Adaptive Space. And I'd have to jump on the bandwagon here with Rob and say that this is an awesome book. I don't often endorse books. I get asked to do it quite often, but I did endorse Michael's book because I think it really is excellent and took, a lot of Rob's work that is, academic and in rigorous in its, in its research basis, and applied it, in a real practical way with a very, complex organization, right? And an organization that's been around for a long, long time. So you think about Agile and you think about General Motors. I'm not sure those two things would go together from its history, recent history, but today it's transforming. Today it's just amazing, what it's doing. And I think, Michael's work has been really front and center in that regard. But the question here was around that is, the book is amazing. How can we paint a more realistic picture for leaders regarding these challenges? One of the organizations I'm working with, a group adopting Agile, which has increased collaboration requirements to the point of inertia. The teams aren't managing how work is accomplished or subtracting traditional meetings to gain consensus. Any comments on that, Rob?
Yeah, I mean, so I'm going to, two things, and I don't mean this to be promoting the connected comments here, but what I'm telling you is not trying to sell a membership. Let me say this. What I'm telling you is it's a public service that we offer everybody with a group, and one of the things we do is a quarterly webinar virtual course that we offer to everybody. We make the software free, etc. And my point in doing this is getting these network analytics is nowhere near as hard as people think, and it's actually not as insurmountable to do these network analyses. So we teach people how to do this in a 6-session virtual course, give them homework data sets, give them the software, create a community amongst people so they can ask each other questions. And we've seen people be wildly successful in bringing this information into some of the decisions that you're talking about there. Again, completely free. You can sign onto the site and be able to look for it. The other thing I would urge you to do is look at the Commons site and go into this collaborative overload toolkit. And just get a sense of what's here. And I had a colleague of mine that created these videos that can kind of give you a sense of the ways that we see companies using this to drive down collaborative demand. So there's a little ceremonial music in the background that you can kind of pass right by. But just think about using some of these tools. Again, the online assessment we make available to everybody, because we find that just getting these dimensions out there and getting people talking about them has a big success rate. Right, and in terms of ways of not just coming at the collaborative aspect and thinking more is better. So that would be two very, very pragmatic things, and me not being too academic about it.
Yeah, so I think a question directly related to that, Rob, is how do we introduce O&A without causing fear of retribution? We have fear at my organization that an O&A will uncover weaknesses in their group or their network.
Yeah, that's a great question, and this to me is it's really hard to answer. So because the cultures are so different to me, and that's one of the amazing things about being in my role is I'm in 40, 50, 60 companies. We have 80 that are in the Commons now, and we're kind of shrinking that down to the really vibrant organizations that are doing things with the ideas. And the interesting piece to me is people in their culture, they believe that's how everything is. and it just is so different across organizations in terms of this idea of fear. We've been mapping fear recently in some of the network analyses, and you see that it's just very different in terms of sensitivity. Now, what I typically see is we can come back with the network information in many ways. People are used to seeing these diagrams with names on it. We never show a network diagram with names on it, right? Because it disenfranchises people. It doesn't make it an effective use of people's times. There's other analytics we're showing, like heat maps, bubble charts, things like that help hone in on opportunities without, disclosing, troublesome points, if you will, or getting people upset. And part of it is in the nature of the confidentiality you guarantee. And we almost always do assessments in ways that say individual names are not going to be released. There may be one or two people that see the results so that they can make certain decisions, but those people are targeted and trusted members of that group. Number two, we're also super cautious in how we're presenting it. So if we go down and we're focused on who are the people that are getting overwhelmed, 3 to 5% of the people absorbing 20 to 35% of the demands, and that really need to focus on these collaborative overload tools, the notion for me is never going back and saying, how did you get here? Why are you here? Look, look at the impact. It's more about, gosh, we've never had this lens on how things are getting done, but look what it's doing to us. And we need to kind of rethink how we're working. And this is good for you. It's good for the people around you. And I find that just that specific twist of, no wonder you're here, because we've never had this information. We've never been looking at or managing this. We'll manage the airline receipts down to 2 decimal points, but we've never been managing this. So no wonder you're in this spot, and let's figure out how to get out of it. That works really well in every place that I've been in. So part of it, again, is different culturally, but so much of it is just in the way you use the information and kind of roll it out that has the desired effect.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. And kind of a related question there, I think, is the rise of human capital analytics functions, capabilities within organizations. I'm wondering if you're seeing O&A in this kind of analysis embedded into these analytics groups in a way that maybe you didn't see in the past. And is that bringing this methodology more to the forefront?
But both pros and cons. So if I looked at one group that's exploded in terms of my research group, it's been the people analytics roles. And we find, for example, the studies we've done around attrition, we find that the network variables almost always significantly outpredict the predictive analytic models that are in place in organizations. And intuitively, right? That what was the old Gallup thing? Have a friend at work, right? And that's this huge predictor, but you don't know who that is or how do you go build trends or things like that. The more we can be precise and say it's this kind of connection at this point in somebody's tenure that matters, then you can really do things that start to cultivate and build, talent differently. So, on the one hand, I have some amazing success stories of people that have come at this and said, how do we use the network analytic ideas to alter talent processes? On the other hand, the one that kills me and drives me absolutely nuts is people go out and they hire some PhD that's coming out of a program, and I've been one of them before, so let's just say it's me earlier in my life, and they say, oh, we have somebody that knows O&A, and they don't. They actually have somebody that's learned how to do it from a scientific standpoint, but oftentimes we're finding that and then there's a totally valid need for that. So don't get me wrong on this. There's a definite need to understand scientific bases of performance, of attrition, of well-being today, all sorts of things like that. But the measures that inform what you need to do to reduce attrition or what you need to do to promote engagement or better individual performance are very rarely the network measures that the social scientists are using to prove their statistical models. And so you really need to get analytic people, not just somebody that's done an O&A, because it drives me crazy. I hear if I'm on one call, it's at least one call a week where somebody says we did O&A, and all they did was generate a diagram and then wonder why did it go somewhere, right? Why didn't people get it? And then they blame O&A, and it's not. It's getting the data in a format that informs decisions. That is the real trick with it. So if you're in this cusp and you're thinking about engaging with some kind of effort around collaborative analytics, I would focus more on that than getting to somebody that's coming out of a major PhD program or whatever that's just done it from a scholarly standpoint. You've got to be able to cross that divide. And to that point, let me see, we're running tighter on time here. Let me give you one other set of resources that are out there and also tied to the toolkit that IRC4HR has made available and put up on the website. One of the 12 lessons is around transitions, right? And what we've focused on incredibly heavily there are some failure points when people transition in. So one of the common failure points is leaders that come in and they try to be the indispensable expert and force kind of greater reliance on themselves as that expert. And where we see that works initially, but then it tends to lead to a derailer about 18 months in. Because they haven't created a context where they can diffuse the work. And it's too hard for them to get others to take their place in meetings or things like that. Another real common one is people come in and they just focus on the formal structure. This is something that I think is a real challenge with everybody that's following traditional onboarding methodologies like first 90 days. That stuff is absolutely great, but it was built around targeting stakeholders without this network lens in place. And what we find is the people that transition in well, they're definitely going to the formal stakeholders, but they're also creating a much broader network than we've understood until recently that matters, early stage. So, the resource that I would urge people to take a look at, posted in terms of the one specific lesson, but also on the Commons website, there's other tools out there, as we've really focused on transitions in these networks, and we see that there are very specific things that people do in terms of ways they come in to initiate relationships, specific things they do in terms of how they're engaging people. And I mentioned one already, this idea of pull versus push. And then specific things they're doing that is very rarely focused on in most organizations that are occurring in about the 9 to 18 month window that are about refining their network practices. So what works initially is great to create demand and slingshot you in, but if you continue to persist on that and don't do things that create network breadth and network efficiency, then you tend to falter later on. And what we've done with this is another, simple device. In addition to writing white papers, we're just about to release this one, is we put it into card decks where we say, there's 12 ideas here around how people initiate, engage, and refine networks, and people can come in and use these to see how are we doing in each of these areas. Right, very simple tools to kind of sort out which one of the practices in each of these domains do we need to focus on. And you can kind of leverage these cards to see, what do I need to do as an individual? Hover over the QR code that we have here, which my friend Greg Pryor brought to my attention has been the coolest thing we've done. And these QR codes actually take you out to a lesson planning site that gives you a lot of different kinds of resources, for video materials on this, the lesson paper, etc. So I would take a look at that. And this is all available, again, publicly through the Commons. Each of these lessons looks like this. There's a very specific focus on what is this thing that we're talking about, right? And so one of the principles on entry is that the people tend to surge early with a proactive outreach to a broad cross-boundary network. And it talks a little bit about why this matters. But then the key thing that looks incredibly simple is always the second side of the lesson idea, where in this case it's the table of the kinds of connections that we see distinguish the more successful people. And again, it's not just the formal leaders that people are getting to, but they're getting to colleagues that create a sense-making network for them. They're engaging their teams in different ways. They're getting support functions on board with them before they have need. And this is a real easy framework, right, to put down with people on entry and say, okay, what do we need to do to help you build connections in a very targeted way? So with that, I'm going to pause and kind of bring us to a conclusion here. But I wanted to use a little bit of what Mike said at the end there, the question around how do we get these ideas in play. It's not network analysis as traditionally defined that helps win the game. It's getting the analytics and into informing practices that's the real key. And I'd urge people to kind of really embrace what IRC4HR enabled us to do, with these specific lesson plans, and be able to kind of see and target activities on that front. So with that, let me pause there, and Mike, turn it back to you, see if there are any final questions, and if not, I'll say thank you to everybody.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. I think you can all see why I say Rob's one of my favorite professors, academics out there in the world. The translation of the, theory to practice and real life examples, is something that is just at the core of Rob's work and the work of the Connected Commons. And I think it's just amazing work that actually all of you can take back and apply in your own organization. So thank you very much, Rob. Thank you very much, IRC for HR. We've really enjoyed working with both of you on this webinar series and this research that you've now taken to practice. So thank you very much, and thank you all for being on the call today. And it's top of the hour, so we're going to sign off. Thank you very much.